Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is November 25th, 2022, and we're at a moment that's extremely interesting on the one hand, but quite dangerous on the other. We just had another Schiller Institute conference, the third in a series, just this last week, and we can be talking about that later. But I think we should start with the fact that you're not getting a picture of what's actually going on, the real danger that exists in the war in Ukraine, with the media basically saying Russia's being defeated, there's a lull in the war. It's actually a very different picture, isn't it, Helga?
Oh yes, I think what this situation proves is that the idea that more weapons to Ukraine will lead to peace, or the opposite is the case. You see a daily escalation. The recent phase is that Russia resorted to making a complete barrage on the electricity grid in Ukraine. So many Ukrainian cities, Kiev, Odessa, Kharkov, are without electricity. With the winter approaching, the situation in Ukraine becomes quite desperate. But as the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Nebensia, just emphasized, this is the reaction to the reckless increase of weapon deliveries to Ukraine. The West has been sending, and unfortunately Germany as well, and the United States, obviously, they have been sending more modern weapons, and without which the Ukraine war would have ended already. Maria Zakharova, the Russian spokeswoman from the foreign ministry in Moscow, she said, that basically everything the Ukrainian army is doing is coming from the West: mercenaries, training, intelligence. Uh, so de facto, we have a war between NATO and Russia already, and that should people should really be aware of what that means. This could go out of control at any moment. And we were very close to that already when these two Ukrainian missiles hit the territory in Poland, where Zelensky had insisted, this was Russia, despite the fact that President Biden from Bali had said, no, there is no intelligence to to support the idea that it was Russian missiles. In the meantime, there has been an enormous amount of discussion, that given the fact that both the United States and Russia have complete surveillance over the, the territory and the airspace of Ukraine, everybody knows what is the trajectory of these missiles. So there are a lot of questions. Was it a deliberate false flag operation? Why was there no defensive action? I mean, after all, the Polish border is the NATO border. Why was there no attempt to shoot these missiles down? Why was there immediately a whole barrage of NATO meetings? As if NATO is sitting practically in the tracks for any incident to happen. So this, really should wake people up that we have to have a different conception, because the only victims of this is the Ukrainian people. They are now, even I think Mayor Klitschko from Kiev is encouraging people to leave Kiev to find some place to, somehow make it through these horrible days and weeks. So I think the development of this has absolutely shown that the idea of more weapons to Ukraine is not going to end the war. The Turkish foreign minister just emphasized that he does not see a military solution to this war. And that's why a different approach has to be taken. But we have to expect that this is getting much worse and much dangerous, because the Royal Institute, the UK think tank, the oldest think tank in the UK, RUSI, had basically suggested that there should be a Cuban Missile Crisis on steroids over Crimea. That Ukraine should try to retake Crimea. This would lead to extremely dangerous situation, but that only in this utmost moment of danger would there be a possibility to sit down. I mean, this is just insanity. This is playing with the existence of civilization. And unfortunately, the Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine, Volodymyr Rivlov, basically said, that they expect something to happen before the end of the year in terms of Ukraine retaking Crimea. Then there is all this talk, Politico and so forth. They're reporting that the Biden administration expects that Russia would use chemical weapons before they use nuclear weapons. And that despite the fact that the Russians are saying, almost on a daily basis, that the use of nuclear weapons is not an option for Ukraine, because they have said very clearly they will use nuclear weapons only if the existence of the Russian state is at stake. But this is really, I can only say, people should really be aware that this present course we have to change.
And when you talk about the war policy coming out of NATO, we had in the last days Stoltenberg and also Ischinger, the former head of the Munich Security Conference, saying that this war has to continue until Russia is defeated. That's about to happen. And this led to some very interesting comments from Scott Ritter on the situation in Germany, where he called on the Germans to wake up. What did you think about Ritter's comments?
Well, it's a horrible occasion, but I really appreciated that video he made, especially addressed to the German people, very much. I mean, Ritter is very polemical. He says, do you really, to the German people, do you really want to die for NATO? And then he said, that the German people are behaving like sheep, and he even used the language of the sheep, meh. Uh, it was a real polemical insult, but I think that given the fact that the Germans for sure would be the first ones to die in a nuclear war, I think it's quite adequate, because you can see very clearly that the German people are waking up, especially in East Germany, but even in West Germany. But this present government, at least for the Green part, Habeck and Baerbock, but also the FDP, Lindner, but especially their so-called expert in the military, in the defense committee in the Bundestag, Strack-Zimmermann. These are such war hawks, and you cannot differentiate them from the State Department and the British government in terms of being absolutely bellicose. So I think Scott Ritter's video was highly appreciated, and I would ask everybody, we will put the link under this webcast, and I would really ask everybody to send it to any German people, if you know any, because that is a wake-up call which is urgently needed.
Now, I mentioned earlier the Schiller Institute conference. This was the third in a series we've had with present and former elected officials, senior activists and intellectuals and others that took up this whole question of the title was Stop the Danger of Nuclear War Now. And this is archived on the Schiller Institute site. We did have this time a significant participation from Germany, but I think the most important thing, Helga, is that you concluded the conference with a proposal for widespread discussion and debate on 10 principles that you put forward to guide the new international security and development architecture. And I think it would be very important for you to just go through what's included in that.
Well, we have been calling for a new international security and development architecture based on the principles of the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia ended 150 years of religious war in Europe, basically because all war parties realized that a continuation of the war would be to absolutely nobody's benefit, because everybody would be dead. 1/3 of large parts of Europe at that time were completely destroyed in terms of villages, cattle, people. So that led to a negotiation where the outcome was that people recognized that any peace treaty has to take into interest the interest of the other, of every party. And if you don't have a consideration of the interest of all war parties, you will not get peace. Now, that Peace of Westphalia led to the international law, which really only emerged after the peace treaty of Westphalia. And that went into the UN Charter, and it's still the body of international law up to the present day. The Versailles Treaty, on the other side, which did not take into account the interest of everybody, especially not Germany, was the prelude to the next World War. And if there is any lesson to be learned from these experiences, we need a new international security architecture which is applying for everybody. And especially, in a time where you have nuclear missiles, the internet, pandemics, we are sitting in one boat. It's not possible to find a peace order for Europe and not for the Indo-Pacific or vice versa. You have to have a solution for the whole world. Now, that's why I attempted to, write down some basic principles. Not that I want to claim that that is the final version, and but I just wanted to get the discussion going by concentrating on what should be the ideas which are applicable to the whole world. Now, I can only suggest that people read these proposals because they're quite dense. But the first question actually is that we have to reinstall the principle of absolute sovereignty, and that there has to be an alliance or a partnership of perfectly sovereign republics or nation states, in cohesion with the UN Charter and with the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And I think that idea, that without the idea of sovereignty, non-interference in the internal affairs of the other, respect for the different social system, I mean, these are the ideas which really have to be reintroduced. And this whole idea about interventionist right to protect, all these policies which were introduced by Blair, who deliberately wanted to get rid of the principle of the Peace of Westphalia, that has to be stopped. And we have to return to the idea of the interest of the other and sovereignty as an absolute important ingredient if you want to have a peaceful world. Then naturally, the second point I made is to overcome poverty. I think the idea of a joint mission of all countries of poverty alleviation is very crucial. That has to be the principle on which a new credit system has to be based. And it's just not tolerable that right now already 1.7 billion people are threatened with immediate starvation. And that will get worse as the financial crisis of the West, of the liberal system, is getting worse. So the idea of poverty alleviation is an absolute important mission. Then naturally involved with that is the idea of the image of man. If you think that man is a nuisance to nature, and each human being is a burden on nature, then naturally you will not arrive at any solution. But if you have the idea that every human being has a unique potential of creative ability of discovering new principles of the physical universe, that it's generally called scientific and technological progress, and that ability differentiates human beings completely from all other living beings. No other species can do that, and it is that ability of discovery which enables you to have a higher living standard, longer longevity, more people living a good life. So this idea of being clear on what is the character of the human being is a very important idea. And then naturally, the idea of a new credit system, a new health system, and various other points. So I think, I want to challenge people to look at these 10 principles and, write something else. If you don't agree with them, let's have a debate. But I think everything is better than to sit there passively and wait until nuclear war has extincted the human species. So let's have a discussion on how can we give ourselves principles to govern ourselves. I mean, this was a big debate in the early phase of the American Revolution in the Federalist Papers, where all kinds of authors were saying, how do we have to give ourselves principles to self-govern? And this time, this task is for sure there for the entire human species and the international community. So I put out a challenge to start such a discussion.
Helga, I've been sending that around, and I actually got a question for you that's quite interesting from a fairly prominent person who is involved in economic discussions. And what this person said is it necessary to connect the economic and financial architecture to the security architecture? Isn't that asking too much because of the difficulties with dealing with the economy? Why do you insist on both together? You've partly answered that, but I think it's important that this get across because people are terrified of the idea that, well, if you have a global system, it's automatically going to be tyrannical. So, how would you answer that?
Well, the answer is very simple, that there is no peace without development. Therefore, in a certain sense, the reason why the security architecture can function is that if all the different partners, all the different countries are united in an effort to overcome poverty, to create a decent life for especially the countries of the global south, but also for the many poor in the global north, because there has been a process where more and more people become poor in America, in European countries. The so-called tables, the soup kitchens, more and more people have to go through that. In any case, what we need, therefore, is a new world economic order supported by a new credit system which allows real economic development and a cooperation among countries to support each other in carrying that out. And it is that development, that idea of peace through development, which will make the security architecture function. So it's not a static conception. It's not something, like where you put bureaucratic rules which will be forever, but it will be the idea of a dynamic system. I have to explain that the background of this is really coming from, Nicholas of Cusa, the idea of the coincidence of opposites. This is a very profound philosophical conception which Cusa developed in the 15th century. Basically, the idea that man can always find a solution because the human creative mind is capable of synthesizing a higher one. Naturally, Cusa came through this to this thought through theological discussion. For him, the higher one naturally is God, the creator. But it is a method of thinking that Einstein had, by the way, the same idea. He said you will never find a solution on the same level where the problem arises, but you have to, think a higher understanding of the physical laws of the universe, which Einstein did with his general theory of relativity. So it's a method of thinking. It has a religious origin, if you want, but it is a method of thinking how mankind can conceptualize the one interest of the one humanity, which must be above that of nation states. And naturally, Schiller's conception of the unity of the world citizen and patriot is reflected in that. So the idea is basically by creating a developing economic system of higher levels of economic benefits for humanity as a whole, for example, one expression of that will be that we get together as quickly as possible to a fusion-based economy, which will eliminate scarcity. We will have energy security, we will have raw material security, and therefore one big reason for wars will be eliminated. So obviously this is very complex and it needs elaboration, but I think the idea that the principle of development is change, improvement, change for the better. And it happens to be that that is corresponding not only to the lawfulness of the mind, because mankind can always discover more deep principles about the physical universe, but it also, does correspond to the expanding universe and what we know about the James Webb telescope and the Hubble telescope before. We are living in an expanding universe, and the conclusion of my 10 points is basically that we have to aim to create a political and economic order which is in cohesion with the actual lawfulness of the physical universe, so that there is a harmonic development of both. And that, by the way, is an idea which you find in many cultures. For example, in European philosophy, this was the idea that there is such a thing like natural law, a higher lawfulness than that which is created by man. It's sort of created in the creation. There is this natural law. In India, they call it that the cosmological order has to be implemented on Earth by politics. In China, you would probably call it the mandate of heaven, which was even existing before Confucius. So it basically is the idea that we have to go beyond pragmatic ideas and that we have to create an order which is more in cohesion with the actual existence of the universe in which we live and in which we are the most advanced part.
And I believe if people look at the discussion process and the various presentations at the last Schiller Institute conference, which again you can find at schillerinstitute.com for November 22nd, that they'll see that process in motion. And Helga, it seems to me that with the participation of elected and former elected officials from Latin America, Central America, and Europe now, we actually are achieving that discussion. So I'm wondering, what's the next step in this process?
Well, if you look at the three conferences, we had two in October, one in November. Within 5 weeks, we exploded this process of organizing. And I think it corresponds to the fact that there are more and more people around the world who are really scared about the possibility of World War III. You would think Latin America is far away from Ukraine, but the whole process started really with a discussion of some, Mexican and Peru and I think Bolivia, Ecuador parliamentarians, and it quickly expanded. Now, this time we had already two former ministers. We had a former president of Latin America, in this case, Guyana, a former minister from Argentina, from Ecuador. And, these people are really calling out to their colleagues around the world, leaders of the non-aligned movement, legislators, and other elected officials from all over the world, to create a movement of elected officials to appeal and put pressure on the governments to stop this insane war policy. And this time, I'm also very happy that we had significant participation from Europe, especially from some people who have been in these demonstrations, especially in East Germany, craftsmen, mayors, just peace activists who take to the streets because they really don't want to be cannon fodder for an insane NATO war, which can only lead to the destruction of everybody. So this time we had also mayors from France giving support to a peace initiative from the city of Stralsund, which has offered the city territory to be the place for peace negotiations. This goes back to an initiative of that city from, I think, 1370, where they initiated a similar peace a process. So I really think this is very, very encouraging. And the basic idea of it is that at the moment when there is the danger of nuclear war, which could lead to the annihilation of the entire human species, that makes automatically every human being on the planet to be a world citizen. And therefore, we have called this, a movement, a world movement of world citizens. World citizens of all countries unite was the idea.
And just one final point on Latin America. There's been some progress, or I should say, some discussion going on about the assassination attempt against Cristina Kirchner, the vice president of Argentina, uh, targeted by someone with connections to this Azov Battalion global neo-Nazi movement. What's the story there?
Well, this is only the tip of the iceberg, but after 3 months, I think the assassination attempt occurred on September 1st against Cristina Kirchner, her son, but also threatening President Fernandez. And now there was an attempt of a cover-up by the investigating judge after she was removed. They have now identified a person to be the liaison between the Nazi groups and the former President Macri. So, I just wanted to mention that because I think, it really shows that we are in an incredible battle, where people are targeted if they are trying to buck this system. And I think that it's important that the truth comes out. So I think, I just think we are in an incredible period. The next weeks will be of incredible turmoil. The attempt, for example, now to not only dissolve the contact with Russia, which has already happened completely for countries like Germany. Now the incredible government we have right now wants to also cut the ties with China, and the IFO Institute in Munich has basically said this would threaten the entire location of Germany as an industrial state. And this in the middle of an explosion of energy prices, fuel prices. So I think we are going into not only a winter of discontent and possibly brink of nuclear war if this Crimea scenario or the chemical weapon scenario is acted out. But I think we are reaching a period where, a change of the entire order has to occur. And we are working to get the Europeans and the Americans to join with the new emerging system which is developing and not combat it, because that's really what's underneath this Ukrainian crisis. It's not about Ukraine. Ukraine is just a pawn in the larger game.
Well, I think it's very clear from this discussion we've just had that it's time for people to take up your challenge to discuss these principles that you have enumerated in terms of the basis of the new security and financial architecture. People can again go to the schillerinstitute.com and watch the conference from November 22nd. I'm sure we'll have posted in the next day or so these 10 principles, these points that you've laid out. And we'd like your feedback. If you're discussing them, if you're talking to people, if you're going to elected officials to asking them to sign this and join this, let us know what's happening. So Helga, I have nothing else for you. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I want you to become active, because this is a period where, everything will depend, or a large amount of what happens will depend on the subjective factor. Objectively, we are both at the verge of World War III, but we also are on the verge of a completely new system. But which way it will go, I think, will depend on the energy and the number of people who are fighting for a better world system. So join our efforts.
Okay, I think people should take that advice. And Helga, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week.
Let's hope.